Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished scholars and esteemed colleagues, honored guests and viewers, I'm Seon-Wook Kim, a philosophy professor at Sungsil University, which is located in Seoul, Korea. It is my honor to welcome you all to the IVR 2024, the 31st World Congress of the International Association for Philosophy of Law and Social Philosophy. Today, we have the privilege of having been joined by Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard University on political philosophy. He will give us a talk on democracy today. Through this one-hour recording, Professor Sandel and I will engage in a dialogue to explore problems and solutions of democracy today and some other issues. Professor Michael J. Sandel is a well-known political philosopher teaching here at Harvard University. Professor Sandel is renowned for his video lecture, Justice. It has been watched by audience worldwide. His acclaimed writings, including Justice, have been translated into multiple tens of languages. With recent publications such as The Tyranny of Merit and Democracy's Discontent, Professor Sandel continues to provoke thoughtful debates and awaken critical insights into the complexities of contemporary politics in our world. Hello, Professor Sandel.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you. On behalf of the organizing committee of IVR 2024, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to you for participating in this dialogue.
My pleasure.
I would like to start with your new book, Democracy's Discontent. The book describes the danger democracies confront around the world. Why is democracy in trouble? And how did it come about?
Well, thank you for the question and for engaging in this dialogue. It's really an honor to be with you.
Oh, you're
Seon-Wook.
welcome.
Democracy is in turmoil and in trouble in countries around the world. Citizens everywhere seem frustrated with the way democratic institutions are functioning. Frustrated also with the empty terms of public discourse. Our public discourse is largely hollow, of larger meaning, what passes for political discourse these days in most democratic countries is either narrow, managerial, technocratic talk, which inspires no one, or where passion does enter, we have shouting matches, partisan, ideological food fights in parliaments and on television, and especially on social media, which is not doing democracy any good. We're deeply polarized. This, I think, is a condition of democracies around the world,
Right.
Deep polarization. And I think we need to step back, look at recent decades, and ask how this came about. In recent decades, the divide between winners and so-called losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with widening inequalities of income and wealth in recent decades, but it has also to do, I think, with the changing attitudes toward success that have accompanied the widening inequalities. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full bounty that the market bestows upon them, and by implication, that those who struggle, those left behind, must deserve their fate as well. Now, this way of thinking about success arises from a seemingly attractive principle, the principle of meritocracy, the principle that says, insofar as chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. It also arises against the backdrop of a kind of market fundamentalist faith that we've seen during the same 4 or 5 decades. So I would say that the market faith, the widening inequalities of income and wealth, and the changing attitudes towards success that leads the winners to believe their success is their own doing, these together have contributed to the anger, the resentment, the frustration that has led to the polarization that now really poses a threat to the flourishing of democratic societies and democratic institutions.
Well, in your book, Democracy Discontent, you identify two public philosophies or two rival conceptions of freedom.
Yes.
That have long been in tension. What are these two conceptions of freedom? Can you explain them?
Yes. Well, in Democracy's Discontent, I look back across the American political tradition, and I try to identify, as you say, two competing conceptions of freedom, two public philosophies.
Yes.
One of them, perhaps the most familiar these days when we think about freedom, is a liberal conception of freedom. And it's the idea that says that we are free insofar as we are able to choose our ends and pursue our interests without obstruction, unimpeded by others. This version of liberal freedom goes along with the idea of liberal neutrality. Government or civil society should not try to cultivate or inculcate any particular conception of virtue or the good life, because in pluralist societies, to try to cultivate any particular conception of virtue might lead to coercion of those who hold a different conception of the best way to live. So this is the liberal conception of freedom that's very prominent today, especially in Anglo-American countries, but not only there. It's become widespread.
In Korea too.
In Korea as well.
Yes.
And it's closely connected, this liberal conception of freedom, and this is part of what empowers it and spreads it to societies around the world. It's closely connected to a consumerist idea of freedom. Because if I think of myself mainly as a consumer, then I think of freedom as consisting in my ability to pursue and act on my preferences, my interests, my desires, compatible with a similar liberty for others. So the liberal conception of freedom easily slides into a consumerist a kind of identity and way of thinking about what it means to be free. But this is not the only way of thinking about freedom. This is one of the arguments that I make in Democracy's Discontent. Certainly throughout the American political tradition, but also going back to earlier political philosophers, has been a rival conception of freedom, the civic Republican conception of freedom. On the civic conception, to be free is to have a voice, a meaningful say in shaping the forces that govern our collective lives, our collective destiny. To be free is to share in self-rule. To be free is to be able to deliberate with fellow citizens about common purposes and ends. So on the civic conception of freedom, it's not enough simply to be able to act according to my interests and preferences. It's also necessary that citizens generally have a sense of virtue and concern for the common good, respect for their fellow citizens as equals, in order to deliberate about the meaning of virtue, the common good, and a just society. Now, on the civic conception of freedom, government and public life generally can't be indifferent to or neutral toward the qualities of character and the conceptions of the good life that its citizens espouse. According to the civic conception of freedom, politics is unavoidably a contest and a debate about questions of the common good, questions of civic virtue, questions about the qualities of character that citizens require if they're to have an effective voice. Now, the argument I make in Democracy's Discontent is that the civic conception of freedom was more prominent in the early decades of the American Republic.
Is that right?
Where the founders had a very strongly civic conception. They thought that you can have institutions of government, you can have separations of power, you can try to invent constitutional mechanisms so that ambition will check ambition, but they didn't think that was sufficient. They thought cultivating virtue in citizens was necessary to have a flourishing democratic republic. Gradually, over the course of 2 decades, the civic strand of the American political tradition was gradually crowded out, so I argue in the book, by the liberal conception of freedom. And by the 20th century, and especially in the decades after the Second World War, the second half of the 20th century, the liberal conception of freedom begins to predominate, and the civic conception of freedom is not entirely extinguished, but it goes into eclipse. And my broader argument, bringing this to the current moment and to the current peril democracies confront, insofar as people feel that their voices don't matter, insofar as there's a pervasive sense of disempowerment among citizens of democratic society, this, I think, reflects the decline of the civic understanding of freedom and the institutions and the social and political practices necessary to sustain it. So my broader argument is if we're to address the widespread sense of disempowerment in democratic societies, the sense among citizens that their voices don't matter, and if we're also to address the sense people have, I think rightly, that the moral fabric of community is unraveling and that this is dislocating, and then I think we need to try to find ways to revive and to redefine the civic strand of freedom that has long been seen as essential to a healthy, flourishing democracy.
Well, these two conceptions of freedom, the liberal and the civic republican conception,
Yes.
Each suggests different ways of thinking about the economy. So economy
Yes.
matters these days.
Right.
You say we need to recover a political economy of citizenship.
Yes.
What does this mean? And what would be an example?
Yes. A political economy of citizenship. This is a way of thinking about the economy that goes beyond simply asking, how can we maximize GDP or economic growth? And how can we ensure the fair distribution of the fruits of prosperity and economic growth? Now, to be sure, these questions are important. One important purpose of the economy is to organize productive activity in a way that promotes prosperity, rising affluence, and economic growth. That's one purpose of an economy.
Right.
Another important purpose of an economy is to ensure not only prosperity and affluence and economic growth, but the fair distribution of the fruits of that prosperity. So growth and fairness, these are important parts of any economy,
Right.
important measures of how successful an economy is. But it seems to me they are not sufficient. They're not the only considerations that matter, and that we need to evaluate economic policies and economic arrangements, not only from the standpoint of growth and distribution, but also from the standpoint of self-government. What economic arrangements are compatible with democratic self-rule, with self-government. Let me give a concrete example. Antitrust or anti-monopoly law. This became a subject of debate in the late 19th century in the United States, when vast, powerful corporations were beginning to dominate the economy. Back then, it was the railroads, the banks, and the oil companies that had accumulated vast economic power, but also vast political power. And people worried, citizens worried, that with big concentrated economic power, threatened democracy because it threatened to dominate political decision-making and leave little room for citizens to deliberate and to decide for themselves and through their democratic institutions how they wanted to be governed. And one solution, and this was much debated, how to deal with the threat posed by concentrated economic power to democracy, to democratic institutions. And one of the solutions was antitrust, anti-monopoly policy that was enacted. Now, today, we still have, in most democratic societies, some version of antitrust law.
Yes, right.
Or anti-monopoly law. But today, we think of it mainly as a way of protecting the consumer. Because the theory of monopoly today, the dominant one, is that the problem with monopoly is that a few companies dominating an industry can drive up consumer prices because there isn't genuine competition for the consumer. And it's true that monopoly power does have this effect on enabling some companies who dominate markets, who don't face much competition, to boost consumer prices beyond what they would be in a truly competitive economy. But that's not the only rationale for antitrust law. We have forgotten, we've lost sight of the traditional purpose of antitrust law, which was to hold economic power to democratic account, to prevent such concentrations of power in the economy that they would frustrate democratic control and democratic authority. And so here's an example, very concrete example, of an area of law and policy where the civic conception of freedom has gradually given way to the consumerist idea of freedom. And the civic democratic rationale for antitrust has faded and given way to the consumerist rationale for antitrust. Now, recently, it's interesting that the Biden administration has initiated vigorous antitrust policy, especially vis-a-vis the tech companies and the social media companies.
Yes, right. Yes, right.
Because now they are the companies that exert enormous power over the economy, and where there is relatively little competition, or they've been able to dominate their competition. And so, but it's clear now that action needs to be taken to rein in the power of big tech and social media. And the Biden administration has begun to do this in a serious way. And the rationale can't only be consumer price competition. Facebook is free to the user. But the threat it poses is to democracy, as we've seen, with misinformation and with toxic postings, toxic public discourse.
Right.
So I think there is now an opening to revive the civic rationale for antitrust when we recognize the danger to democracy posed by big tech and social media companies.
Michael, then how does all of this explain the populist backlash against the elite and the rise of Donald Trump? You've often expressed some worries about him, right? And I remember you were very critical about what happened in the Capitol Hill in January of 2021.
Yes. Well, the January 6th attack by Trump supporters on Capitol Hill to try to obstruct the certification of the election, which had gone against him. This, I think it shocked the world. It certainly shocked the American public. We didn't think the democratic institutions could come under a violent siege in this way by a president who refused to concede that he had lost the election and who incited his supporters to go and try to prevent Congress from certifying the results. So this was a shocking moment that illustrated how democracy is in peril today.
Right.
We can no longer take for granted the stability of democratic institutions. We saw that on January 6th. Now, to go back to your question, what does democracy's discontent and what does this sense of disempowerment have to do with the rise of Donald Trump?
Right.
I think we need to take this seriously and address and really diagnose this closely. Because very often those who are critical of Donald Trump and consider him a threat or a clown or a buffoon or a would-be dictator are so consumed by their outrage at Trump that they forget to ask, how is it that mainstream politics by both parties, center-right and center-left, Republican and Democratic parties, the failure of mainstream parties prepared the way, opened the way to Donald Trump. In part, this is because, in my view, now speaking about the American experience, over 4 or 5 decades, both parties embraced a version of market-driven, finance-driven globalization that brought widening inequalities and that created enormous anger and resentment by many working people against credentialed elites, against academic elites, against media elites, and Washington and New York elites. And this anger and frustration fed a politics of grievance that Donald Trump was very effective at exploiting. Now, some of the grievances he exploited and inflamed were ugly grievances based in racism and misogyny, xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and he continues to voice these dark sentiments in his campaign to be elected a second time. But, and that should be condemned and is rightly condemned by Trump's opponents. But I think it's important to recognize that mixed up in those ugly sentiments and the racist appeals that Donald Trump makes is appealing to grievances that are actually legitimate about a great many working people feeling that elites look down on them, that their voice doesn't matter, that the work they do is not honored and respected. And this, I think, is the fault of the kind of politics, the narrow political vision and hubristic political vision of governing elites, mainstream parties, Democrats and Republicans, during this period of globalization, where both parties pursued an agenda that financialized the economy, deregulated the financial industry, promoted the offshoring, the outsourcing of jobs to low-wage countries with lax labor and environmental protections, that left the wages in real terms of working people stagnant for nearly 50 years. So the gains from globalization, and the gains were considerable, went to those at the top 10 or 20%, reaped most of the gains in the United States of globalization. Those in the bottom 50 or 60% of the population realized only an infinitesimal share of the gains from economic growth that came during the decades of globalization. And so not only was there widening inequality, not only were there job losses and wage stagnation, but going back to the attitudes toward success that I mentioned, those working people who did not have a college degree, a university degree, felt that well-educated, well-off, professional classes, the winners of globalization, didn't really respect the work that working people do, look down on them with a kind of disdain. And this goes to the meritocratic hubris, as I call it, in the tyranny of merit. This really gets to the heart of the tyranny of merit, the idea that if I make it on my own. I deserve my success. And that means if there are large numbers of people who don't make it, they must be responsible for their fate too. They didn't get a university degree. They didn't do what they were encouraged to do during the age of globalization. We heard these slogans again and again. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to university. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. These were very familiar slogans for 4 decades by Democrats and Republicans alike. And what these elites missed was the insult implicit in this advice. The insult was this: if you're struggling in the new economy, and if you didn't improve yourself by getting a university degree, your failure must be your fault. That's the implication. Now, this is galling. This is humiliating. And especially if you feel that elites are looking down. And a central feature of the populist backlash against elites was the sense that elites are looking down on working people. And Donald Trump, he understood this. The one genuine thing about Donald Trump, the one authentic thing about Donald Trump,
or the only one,
is his sense of grievance. Mm-hmm. His sense of grievance. So though he's a wealthy man, he was able to challenge and articulate the grievances, some of them legitimate, that working people felt about elites looking down.
So this is how you criticize a meritocracy.
Yes. Yeah.
Then what does this have to do with governance by technocracy and expertise?
Yeah.
Aren't there some advantages to being governed by experts? And isn't this part of the appeal of meritocracy?
Well, part of the appeal, you're right, part of the appeal of meritocracy is we want to be governed competently.
Right.
And not only in government. We want social roles to be allocated to those who can perform them well. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it.
Yes.
If I'm flying in an airplane, I want a well-qualified pilot at the controls. That's merit.
Now you can use the Korean Airlines. I'm kidding. Okay.
That's merit. Having well-qualified people performing important social roles, including governing. So does that mean that we should be governed by experts? Well, yes and no. It's important that there be experts in government agencies, who can provide democratically elected politicians and the public with accurate analysis and information in often highly technical areas to do with the economy, to do with the environment, to do with climate change, to do with how to deal with the pandemic.
Right.
So, of course, it's important to have experts advising democratically elected politicians and informing the public about these questions. But that's different from being governed by experts. The difference is this. It's captured in another slogan that we've heard a lot recently. Follow the science. Follow the science. Have you heard that
Right.
slogan in Korea?
Well, even during the pandemic era, yeah.
Especially during the pandemic. Follow the science. Now, what it meant was, I mean, the valid aspect of that slogan was that it's important that we hear from public health experts and medical experts,
Right.
People who know about vaccines and who know about the transmission of the virus. Of course, we need to hear from them. We need to heed their advice in shaping government policy and also in conducting our own lives in regard to the pandemic. But when it comes to public policy making, when it comes, for example, to deciding whether to mandate the wearing of masks, whether to close public schools, whether to close factories and companies in the midst of a pandemic, the science is important. Public health findings are crucial. But it's a mistake for politicians to claim, I'm only following the science, because the decision whether and when to close down schools, that's a fundamentally political decision about the common good. It's a decision that must be informed by the best scientific advice and the best public health advice. But it can't be determined by experts. That's a kind of technocratic fantasy that if we only had the right scientific information, we would know how to govern. That's a technocratic conceit that's misplaced. And when politicians would say, for example, in closing the schools, well, I'm just following the science, that in a way was an abdication of moral and political responsibility, because what it misses, what a purely technocratic approach to governance misses, is the importance of judgment. Judgment, including political judgment, that is informed by the best scientific knowledge, but not determined by it. It's not determined by it because making the political judgment, for example, on whether to close a school depends on weighing and balancing the risks and the dangers to the spread of the virus, to the loss of learning time, to the effect on families, to the effect on the economy, prudential questions, questions of judgment, questions of the common good, questions of public education. It goes back to Aristotle's idea of phronesis, or practical wisdom,
Right.
which is really what should govern. So the difference between being governed by experts or technocrats and being governed by political leaders who have some phronesis or practical wisdom That's the difference between following the science and making a judgment, a considered judgment about the common good that can be defended and articulated and explained to the public and debated. Because this is another disempowering effect of a purely technocratic approach to governing, which did come to predominate not only during the pandemic, but also before, during the age of globalization. There, the relevant, those claiming technocratic expertise were certain doctrinaire economists who assured us that if we only had a free flow of capital and goods across borders, then everyone will gain. There may be some losers, but the gains will be sufficient to offset the loss to the losers. This was the expert advice that we were given by mainstream economists and the politicians who heeded them from the 1980s forward. They were in the grip, many of those economists and political figures, in the grip of a certain market fundamentalist faith, in the grip of the assumption that markets and market mechanisms and the free flow of capital and the deregulation of finance will promote economic growth, will increase the stability of the system. Didn't turn out to be that way in the financial crashes and crises that we saw. But that was following the science before the pandemic.
Right.
And I think part of what discredited experts in the eyes of much of the public, even before the pandemic, was that the economistic, market faith, finance-friendly version of economic science did not work out so well. Not only did it lead to the inequalities we've been discussing, it also led to financial crises in East Asia, and then the 2008 financial crisis that required a massive bailout.
Right.
Following the science, the economic science that was being promulgated by those in the grip of the market faith, had led us there. So then the pandemic came. And when people said, follow the science, by then, growing parts of the public were skeptical of experts. And so I think this coincided with the time when there was a backlash against expertise and a feeling on the part of many people that maybe governance by experts, purely technocratic governance by experts, doesn't leave room for genuine debate. There should have been a broader, healthier, robust debate about deregulating the financial industry, for example, rather than saying, oh, the experts say that will make the system more stable. There should have been a more robust public debate about insisting on free capital flows, including short-term capital flows across borders, without regard for local banking laws or restrictions. That didn't work out so well. And perhaps there also should have been a broader debate. It became a very partisan debate about, how to address the pandemic. And so just at this time, we see the backlash. So this is all to say, expertise is very important as a source of advice in governing, but it can't replace political judgment, and it can't and shouldn't replace democratic deliberation and debate.
Well, then what about lawyers other than experts in other field? We have many lawyers in political area.
Yes,
because aren't they have some merit in public affairs because most of the public policies are given in the form of laws.
Yes, well, it's true here too. It's important to have well-informed legal advice, to conduct public policy, and to debate legislation.
Right.
Of course, that's very important. Just as it's important to have scientists inform public health legislation. And it's important to have the voice of lawyers when constitutional questions arise. But it's equally important to recognize, as with scientific experts, that legal expertise by itself cannot replace democratic deliberation and debate among citizens. We see this especially if when we debate constitutional questions, whether constitutions should be reformed or revised. Lawyers should offer advice and help define the alternatives. But democratic citizens have to debate the fundamental principles of justice that must inform any constitutional founding or framing or revision or amendment. These are questions of justice, not just questions of strictly legal expertise. So it's important to have lawyers advise and inform. It's important to have legal expertise among judges and justices. But the most important policy questions and the most important constitutional questions require that we debate the competing conceptions of justice that only we as democratic citizens can decide and should decide.
Okay, thank you. Now, I would like to touch some philosophical, issue.
Yes.
And you've been a critic of liberal neutrality.
Yes.
And what's wrong with the neutrality?
Well, let me begin by saying what's appealing and attractive about neutrality.
Right.
Part of what motivates the version of liberalism that says government, at least in the basic structure of society,
Right.
the basic structure of rights and duties, should be neutral with respect to the competing conceptions of the good that citizens espouse. This is the liberalism, for example, of John Rawls.
Right.
And it draws on the tradition of Immanuel Kant. I've been critical of this version of liberal neutrality, but I should first acknowledge its force, its appeal. The appeal is this: in pluralist societies like ours, people disagree on substantive moral and spiritual questions. People disagree on the meaning of the good life, on the meaning of virtue, on the best way to live. So it's tempting to think that the best way to respect those differences of moral conviction is to try to design constitutional structures and to try to define rights and duties in a way that's neutral toward those controversies, in a way that doesn't take sides in debates about the good life.
Right.
This is the
Got to be
appeal.
neutral, so.
This is the appeal of the version of liberalism that seeks principles of justice that don't depend for their justification on any particular conception of the good life. That's the appeal. That's the aspiration. But I think it's a mistake for two reasons. One philosophical, the other political. The philosophical reason, it's not possible to define and justify fundamental rights to freedom of speech, let's say, to religious liberty, to freedom of conscience, to freedom of assembly. It's not possible to define and to defend those rights without, implicitly at least, taking sides on at least some of the debates we have, some of the disagreements we have about the good life. One much discussed example is the debate about abortion. Should abortion be permitted or restricted, and if so, how? Now, this is a debate that has been very vigorously present and argued about, certainly in the United States and in some other countries. And it's tempting there to say, well, people have different moral and religious convictions about the moral status of the developing fetus. And therefore, we should try to decide the question of whether to permit abortion without regard to that moral or religious question. But the moral logic doesn't work. Because if those who believe that a fetus, even from the moment of conception, is a human person, if they're right in that belief, then they're right that any abortion involves killing, involves taking a human life and killing a human person. So those who believe that even a fertilized embryo is perhaps worthy of some respect, but not the same as the moral status of a child, if they're right, then that has a different implication for how abortion should be regulated or whether it should be permitted. So is it really possible to decide what the law should be with regard to abortion in a way that is neutral on that underlying moral and sometimes religious question? I don't think so. So part of the problem with liberal neutrality is that on certain issues, abortion is one, same-sex marriage, I think, is another. It's not possible to be neutral. In order to argue for liberal or permissive policies, whether it's about abortion or whether it's about same-sex marriage, it's necessary, at least sometimes, to make substantive moral arguments about, well, in the case of same-sex marriage, on the moral goods and the human goods that same-sex unions can express. And those who disagree should be free to make their arguments. And those who favor, as I do, same-sex marriage should address those arguments, take them seriously, and try to articulate the human goods of a lifelong, loving partnership, regardless of the sexual orientation of the partners. Now, these debates can be fraught. They can be fierce. We may not reach agreement. But I don't think we can resolve some of these ethically charged public questions in a way that pretends to be neutral on the underlying question of the good that they raise. So this is the philosophical reason why I reject liberal neutrality. There's also a political reason.
Yeah.
And the political reason is closely connected to the philosophical reason. If it isn't truly possible to be neutral, and yet government is deciding these questions, people sense that there's some bad faith. They sense that their voice is not being heard, that they're not being allowed to articulate and to bring into the public square their moral or religious convictions. And yet a decision is being made, and their view is implicitly being rejected without ever being subject to respectful deliberation. And this, I think, generates a sense of bad faith, and it creates a kind of empty, hollow public discourse. When people are asked to leave their moral and spiritual convictions outside when they enter the public square becomes a place that's empty of larger meaning and deliberation. And that creates a moral vacuum in public life. and in public discourse. And sooner or later, that moral vacuum will be filled. And when it's filled, it will be filled by narrow, intolerant voices that typically take two forms. It'll be filled by fundamentalism or by hypernationalism. Mm-hmm. This is what happens when we empty out public discourse of larger moral meaning and purpose and deliberation and healthy debate, healthy pluralist debate, because people want public life to be about larger questions of meaning. People want to be able to reason together in public about fundamental questions of justice, of the common good, of what we owe one another as fellow citizens. And if these debates aren't happening in the public square, there will be an appeal for those who will try to clothe the naked public square with these harsh, intolerant moralisms, fundamentalism or hypernationalism. And that's exactly what we've seen. And this comes in the wake of the age of the market triumphalist faith. The market faith, I think, also has an appeal very similar to the appeal of liberal neutrality. I think the deepest appeal of markets, or especially over the past 4 or 5 decades, has not been simply that they deliver the goods, rising affluence. It's also that markets seem to be a neutral mechanism to decide fundamental questions of value, how to value this or that contribution to the economy, that seems to spare us the need to debate questions about what contributions to the economy and to the common good are most valuable, and how should they be rewarded and honored and recognized. It's almost as if during the last 4 decades, we have outsourced our moral judgment about the value of people's contribution to the market. Let the market decide who's worth what. But this has yielded a great many outcomes that I think most of us would reject. Do we really believe the market's verdict that a hedge fund manager contributes to the common good 5,000 times the value of a nurse or a school teacher, or for that matter, a physician? Because if we accept the market's measure of value, that's the conclusion to which we come. That's the market's verdict. So the result is not neutral. And here I think there is a parallel between the tendency of the market faith to empty out the public square, public discourse, of substantive moral discourse, and the tendency of liberal neutrality as a political philosophy to empty out public discourse, especially about fundamental rights, of larger moral questions that people, democratic citizens, rightly want to discuss and to debate.
Yeah, I quite agree. And I think your criticism of liberal neutrality is quite persuasive. But let me say one thing for liberals.
Yes.
And historically, aren't they, the liberals, the champions in promoting human rights, including women's rights?
Well, yes, liberals broadly speaking, and here we need to distinguish between liberal neutrality, which is only one very particular version of the liberal tradition, and the liberal tradition more broadly conceived. If we look at the liberal tradition broadly conceived, many liberals, both political philosophers and citizens and activists, many liberals have not embraced neutrality. Many liberals have defended their vision of a pluralist, more equal society that respects human rights in the name of certain fundamental human goods.
Mm-hmm.
So, and much, not all, but much of the human rights movement does appeal to fundamental moral conceptions about human flourishing. Some strands of the human rights movement try not to engage with substantive conceptions of human flourishing and to rest instead on Kantian, Rawlsian notions of respect for persons as persons. So it's important to distinguish, I think, within the human rights tradition, those who do and those who don't ground human rights on certain articulated conceptions of human flourishing and human purposes and ends. Now, and the same is true if we look at the women's rights movement and civil rights movement combating racial injustice. If we look at what actually animated those movements and brought them to public awareness and to political attention, were forms of social activism and social movements that drew powerfully on the civic Republican tradition of trying to educate the public through social movements, social activism, public protests, teach-ins, forms of public education and persuasion. And this requires a form of activism, of civic activism and engagement that represents the women's movement and the civil rights movement at their best. So the moral of the story, I would say, of the women's movement, going back to the suffragettes who were pressing for the right to vote, and to the activism, the civic activism of the civil rights movement, which in the 1950s in the United States, combating segregation on buses and in public accommodations and in schools,
Right.
the moral seedbed, the moral foundation of that movement were the Black Baptist churches in the South. And Martin Luther King drew not only on secular, neutral, liberal rhetoric, he grounded the case for civil rights deeply in Christian religious traditions and in a certain reading of the American political tradition, a certain conception of what it is to be true to the American tradition. These were two situated sources of Martin Luther King's case for civil rights. One Christian, the other American, that went along with the strand of his argument about universal respect for persons as persons, which would be closer to what we see, as in retrospect, as the liberal neutrality strand. So the civil rights as a civic project, women's rights as a civic project, drew on understandings and practices and forms of activism that the civic Republican tradition has long been concerned with, and with a certain conception of civic virtue, citizen virtue. So I would claim I want to embrace human rights and civil rights and women's rights, but I want to challenge the assumption that they are solely the product of liberal neutrality.
Well, the word situated, that lead me to maybe more philosophical question. And you have often argued against the idea that we are self-made and self-sufficient. What do you mean by this? And what is your alternative way of conceiving the self?
Yeah, well, you're right. I have argued against what I've called the unencumbered self.
Yes, right.
And I've argued instead for the idea of a situated self. And by that I mean that we are not self-made and self-sufficient. And this goes back to the discussion we had about freedom.
Right.
We can't and shouldn't conceive what it means to be free as simply as being a self, an autonomous self, unencumbered or unclaimed by any prior history, tradition, or moral ties, solidarities. To be a full human person requires, I think, not that we abstract from what situates us, from our life history, and from the communities with which our life history may be entangled, but that we reflect on our life history and the traditions that inform it and the communities that have shaped those traditions. Because when we reflect as situated selves, we don't just follow tradition blindly. We don't just say, what are the values that my community happens to espouse at any given moment? We reflect critically, but we never reflect from a point beyond the world. We never reflect from nowhere. The point of reflection is never finally secured outside the history and the life experience and the traditions themselves. So this is, so as against the unencumbered self, I argued for a reflectively situated self, where the project of interpretation, not just willing, but the project of interpretation is bound up with choosing and with freedom. So freedom on this picture is not only a faculty of the will, willing in a way that's autonomous from or unencumbered by my past history, tradition, community, and entanglements. It's to be free is to interpret, and I can always may get the interpretation wrong at any given moment, but it's to reflect on and interpret the obligations that claim me in light of my life experience and the history that situates me in communities with others. And I think this is also a way that connects freedom with civic obligation, because it grows out of a sense of obligation to those who made my achievements possible. To go back to the dark side of meritocracy, its tendency to encourage, especially the successful, to think of themselves as self-made and self-sufficient. This leads us to forget the luck and good fortune that help us on our way, and it leads us to forget our indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible. So this is the folly, this is the illusion that we are self-made and self-sufficient. But that illusion, or rather that self-image, does figure often in animating the market faith, and in animating and inspiring the meritocratic faith. And so I've written critically of the market triumphalist faith and of the tyranny of merit. The tyranny of merit in particular produces, both draw on this idea, at least implicitly, that we are self-made and self-sufficient. And this leads to a kind of hubris. that is not only a disagreeable quality of character, but it's also damaging to the idea of a shared civic life and of the mutual responsibilities we have for one another, even and especially those who flourish, those who find themselves on top.
Well, this way is how you relate your very philosophical view of the self to a very practical application, saying that humility is for healing this polarization we face today.
Yeah. Yes, I think that so we've come back in a way. We began with the polarization we confront, the deep divisions in our society, our tendency to talk past one another rather than really listening. And you're right, I would diagnose this polarization as connected to the self-image that is deeply embedded in the market faith and in the meritocratic hubris that have come to predominate in recent decades. And it seems to me that questioning our meritocratic hubris, recognizing the role of luck, the contingency that leads some to succeed and others to struggle, enables us to achieve a kind of humility that also is not only a personal quality of importance, humility, it's also the civic virtue we need now. Because why, after all, do the successful owe anything to the rest of the society, and especially those who struggle? If they're self-made and self-sufficient or think of themselves that way, it's hard to explain why they owe anything. On the other hand, when people recognize their indebtedness in the contingency of our condition, it's easier to picture ourselves in other people's shoes. It's easier to look upon someone who's struggling and say, there, but for the accident of birth, or the grace of God, or the mystery of fate, go I. That could be me. This sentiment of humility is missing in much of our public life. It explains why we have such a hard time, I think, listening to one another with respect, even across our differences. But I think cultivating humility as a civic virtue could begin to address the harsh ethic of success that drives us apart, and could possibly point us toward a less rancorous, more generous public life.
Well, thank you for your profound insights and a very thoughtful, perspective in your talk. This might be the final one or two questions to you. What social issues have been occupying you lately? And do you have any writing plans in mind?
Well, I've been thinking, as many of us have been thinking, about technology and the rise of AI. And I've been thinking about the ethical implications of AI. And so a great deal has been written and discussed about this already, including whether privacy is now obsolete in the age of big data, or whether social media is driving us and isolating us in bubbles of opinion where we don't really talk to one another. That's been much discussed. Whether AI is enabling new forms of misinformation and disinformation and deep fakes that will make at least social media discourse and political campaigns just loaded with false and deceptive, misleading information. So those are the ethical aspects that have been much debated. I'm interested in another dimension of ethics in the age of AI, which is whether technology, these new technologies, will change what it means to be human, and whether we'll lose touch with the distinction between what's fake and what's real, whether we will confuse, and perhaps already confuse, virtual human community and connection with the real thing. This seems to me, these sets of concerns worry me the most. They seem to me the largest ethical stakes. Will technology change what it means to be human? So that's what I've been thinking about, and I may write something about it. I haven't quite decided.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your sharing your wisdom and expertise,
Thank you.
With us.
Thank you, Seon-Wook.
Thank you all for joining us today.